Masked attacker threw a knife at tomb guard, but the blade never reached its target. The air was crisp and calm, and the setting sun cast a golden glow over the ancient monument standing proudly in the heart of the city. This was no ordinary sight, but a place steeped in history and tradition, one that demanded reverence and respect. The tomb guard stood still, like a statue, keeping watch over the tomb of the unknown soldier. His uniform, crisp and immaculate, symbolized years of training and discipline. Every day, like clockwork, he took his position, silently standing guard to honor those who had fallen. To the casual observer, it seemed like a simple task, standing tall, unmoving, watching the world pass by. But to the tomb guard, it was much more. This was a sacred duty, a privilege that carried with it great responsibility. It wasn't just about standing in place. It was about upholding the legacy of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The tomb guard knew this, and it gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to stand watch day after day, even as the world around him changed. The training to become a tomb guard was grueling. It took years to be selected, years to be deemed worthy of guarding such a sacred place. The applicants had to pass multiple physical and mental tests. They were tested on their endurance, strength, and ability to remain calm in the face of any challenge. But above all, they were tested on their loyalty and commitment to duty. The tomb guard's role went beyond physical strength. He was expected to be an embodiment of discipline and patience. Hours would pass with nothing but silence and the occasional footsteps of visitors approaching the monument. But despite the calm and routine nature of his job, there was always an undercurrent of tension. Every day brought new challenges, new risks, and sometimes even danger. Yet he never wavered. The uniform, the honor, the legacy, they all kept him grounded, even when the world seemed to move on around him. The tomb guard's eyes scanned the crowd of visitors, his gaze steady and unwavering. There were families taking pictures, tourists admiring the monument, and the occasional chatter that echoed softly in the air. Some people came and went without much thought, perhaps not fully understanding the significance of the place they were visiting. Others, however, seemed to grasp the importance of the monument and the role the tomb guard played. They would watch in quiet admiration, knowing that this was more than just a job. It was a call to preserve history, to protect the memory of those who could not speak for themselves. But no matter how many visitors passed by, the tomb guard never faltered. He stood tall, his posture perfect, his focus absolute. He had learned to block out the distractions, the noise, the movement. His only mission was to honor the fallen and ensure that nothing would disturb the peace of the sacred ground. His feet firmly planted on the ground, knew every inch of the space around him. His movements were precise, measured, always in perfect rhythm. Each step, each motion, each glance was part of the unspoken dance of duty and respect. As the sun began to set, casting a cool shadow over the monument, the tomb guard's thoughts turned inward. There was a quiet stillness that accompanied the evening. The crowds thinned out, leaving the monument with only the faint sounds of the evening breeze rustling the leaves. The air seemed to grow thicker, and the world around him seemed to slow. This was the time of day when he could truly reflect, but reflection was a luxury he rarely allowed himself. He had a job to do, and that job was to remain vigilant, to stay alert, to never allow complacency to settle in. For the tomb guard, the night was as much a part of his duty as the day. He knew that the quiet moments could be just as dangerous as the loud ones. The world was full of unpredictable moments, and he was prepared to face whatever came his way. The time on the clock ticked away, the minutes blending into one another as the shadows grew longer. His mind stayed sharp, despite the peaceful surroundings. The tomb guard knew that every day was different, that each shift carried its own challenges, its own risks. But there was also a deep sense of pride in his heart, knowing that his efforts were part of something much larger than himself. Visitors continued to come and go, some pausing to admire the beauty of the monument, others simply walking by, unaware of the solemn duty being performed in front of them. The tomb guard stood motionless, his eyes unwavering, scanning the area. Nothing escaped his gaze. The occasional bird would flutter by, the only movement breaking the stillness, but otherwise it was calm. He stood as a silent sentinel in a world that seemed to be spinning faster and faster. As the minutes turned into hours, the tomb guard's resolve remained unshaken. He had been here countless times before, and he would be here again tomorrow. The job was endless, but that was the way it was meant to be. It wasn't about the recognition or the applause. It was about something far greater, the duty to protect, to honor, to remember. He had chosen this path, and he would continue down it with the same steadfast commitment that had carried him through each training session, each test, and each moment of silence. And yet, even in the stillness, the tomb guard couldn't shake the feeling that something was different tonight. The air felt heavier, and his senses were more alert than usual. Perhaps it was just the night, the quiet that stretched on longer than he had anticipated. Or perhaps in the back of his mind, there was a sense of unease that he couldn't fully explain. Something was on the horizon, but he couldn't place it yet. For now, however, there was only the monument, the duty, and the quiet vigilance that would carry him through the night. The world around him may have been bustling, but here, at this sacred place, time stood still, and the tomb guard remained as resolute as ever. There was no greater honor than this, no greater responsibility. And nothing, not even the creeping sense of uncertainty, could take that away. As the evening deepened, the crowd around the monument began to thin out, leaving only a few late visitors wandering around. The tomb guard remained as steadfast as ever, his focus never wavering. But in the shadows, something was stirring. It was hard to say exactly when it started, but there was a strange feeling in the air. It was as if the very atmosphere had shifted. The stillness, once calming, now felt tense, charged with something that couldn't quite be named. The crowd had scattered, but not everyone had left. Among the few remaining visitors was a man who did not quite fit in with the others. He moved with purpose, weaving through the scattered groups of tourists. Unlike the others, he wasn't stopping to take photos or admire the monument. His gaze was fixed, but it wasn't on the tomb guard. It was something else, something hidden in the depths of his mind, something dark. The man was dressed in a plain jacket, and his appearance was unremarkable at first glance. But it was his eyes that betrayed him. They were intense, almost wild, and they flickered nervously around the space. He didn't seem like someone there to enjoy the monument. He looked out of place, as if he was searching for something, someone. The way he moved through the crowd with such urgency and stealth was different from the carefree movements of the others. He stopped a short distance away from the tomb guard, his hands tucked into his pockets. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might just be another tourist, lost in thought, caught up in the atmosphere of the place. But that was not the case. In the man's jacket pocket, hidden from view, was a knife, its cold steel gleaming faintly under the fading light. The tomb guard didn't see him at first. His attention was focused on the monument and the few remaining visitors. He kept his posture rigid, his gaze sweeping from side to side, always alert, always ready. But as the man drew closer, a shift in the air caught the guard's attention. It was nothing obvious, nothing that would have seemed out of the ordinary. But the tomb guard had been trained to notice the smallest of details, and there was something about this man that didn't sit right with him. Still, the guard remained composed. It wasn't his job to question the visitors. It was his job to stand, to protect, to remain a symbol of unyielding dedication. The world around him may have been full of distractions, but here, in this sacred place, nothing would break his focus. The man took a few more steps forward, moving quickly now. He glanced around, ensuring no one was watching too closely. His hand slipped into his jacket, fingers brushing against the hilt of the knife. His eyes flickered toward the tomb guard once more, but this time there was a coldness in them. The crowd, unaware of the danger, continued to meander, their laughter and chatter filling the air. But in this small corner of the world, everything had gone still. With a sudden movement, the man pulled the knife from his jacket and, without hesitation, threw it through the air. The blade sailed in a perfect arc, glinting as it flew toward its target, the tomb guard. The motion was so swift that it seemed almost impossible. It was a blur of steel cutting through the air, moving with such deadly precision that anyone watching would have been sure that it was the end. The tomb guard didn't see it coming. He had no time to react. The knife was heading straight for him, its point aimed at his chest. But even as the blade approached, something changed. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, seemed to occur. In that instant, a movement, small but significant, changed the course of the knife. It could have been the wind. It could have been the guard's sudden step to the side. Or maybe, just maybe, it was pure chance. But the result was the same. The blade veered off course, missing its target by mere inches. It happened so quickly that it was almost surreal. One moment the tomb guard was standing as he always did, the next, the knife was in the air, and then it was gone. The crowd didn't seem to notice. They continued their conversations, oblivious to the danger that had just passed them by. But the tomb guard felt it. He could hear the faint sound of the blade cutting through the air, the whisper of it so close to him. And then the knife hit the ground with a loud clatter, harmless and spent. The tomb guard didn't flinch. His training kicked in. He had been prepared for everything, even this. His hand instinctively reached for his sidearm, though he never drew it. He didn't need to. The knife had missed. The threat had been neutralized. The attacker, on the other hand, stood frozen for a moment. His eyes widened in disbelief. He had thrown the knife with all his might, aiming to strike down the guard, but now the blade lay at his feet harmless. The attacker's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for failure. The plan had been simple: strike and run. But now, with the tomb guard standing tall and unshaken, he realized that things had not gone according to his design. A flicker of fear passed across the man's face, but it was quickly replaced with something darker: anger. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. His mind raced, trying to calculate his next move, but in that brief moment of hesitation, the tomb guard was already acting. The guard's eyes were no longer on the monument or the visitors. They were locked onto the attacker. His grip tightened around the handle of his sidearm, but he knew he wouldn't need it. The situation was under control, but only just. He had to make sure it stayed that way. Without a word, the tomb guard took a step toward the man, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no rush, no panic. He was calm, confident, and completely in control. The attacker backed up slightly, his eyes darting around for an escape route. But there was no way out. Not now. The sound of footsteps approaching alerted the tomb guard that help was on the way. Security personnel had noticed the commotion and were rushing to intervene. The tomb guard remained steadfast, never allowing the attacker to get any closer. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. The knife had failed. The attacker had hesitated. And in that quiet, tense moment, the tomb guard stood tall, as unmovable as ever. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever, though in reality, it had only been a matter of moments. The knife, a gleaming streak of silver, flew through the air with deadly precision. The tomb guard stood firm, his body completely still, his face showing no hint of alarm. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like an ordinary day, just another shift for the guard. But in the brief, fleeting instant when the knife was airborne, everything changed. The crowd continued to wander, unaware of the danger that had suddenly appeared. The sounds of light chatter, the clicking of cameras, the gentle murmur of conversation, everything remained the same. Yet for the tomb guard, the world had slowed down. His mind, trained to react in an instant, registered the threat even before the knife had fully left the attacker's hand. It was a reflex, the kind of training that had become second nature after years of service. But even with all his training, he couldn't stop the knife from its path. Not yet. The blade cut through the air like a shadow, its edge gleaming in the fading sunlight. It was almost beautiful in its precision, the way it moved so swiftly, so efficiently, aimed directly at the guard's chest. The tomb guard's eyes flicked to the knife, tracking its motion, but his body remained as stiff as ever. There was no hesitation, no panic, just the sharp awareness of what was happening around him. It was a moment of calm before the storm. In that split second, the tomb guard was entirely focused on the path of the blade. He had to be. Every nerve in his body was alert, every muscle tensed, ready to spring into action. His mind processed every detail, the speed of the throw, the distance, the angle. He knew there was no time to dodge. There was no time to react in the way that most people would. But he had been trained for this. And then, just as quickly as it had been thrown, something unexpected happened. It was as if the air itself had conspired to protect him. The knife, in a strange and almost miraculous turn of events, shifted course. Perhaps it was the wind, a gust that swirled unexpectedly, causing the blade to alter its trajectory. Perhaps it was the tomb guard's subtle movement, a slight shift in his posture as his body unconsciously reacted. Whatever the reason, the knife veered away, just enough to miss its target. The blade, which had seemed destined to strike, suddenly changed direction, passing so close to the guard's body that he could feel the air it displaced. The tomb guard didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His training had kicked in, and his body remained perfectly still, just as it was supposed to. The knife flew past him, missing its mark by mere inches, and clattered loudly onto the stone ground. The sound of the blade hitting the hard surface echoed through the stillness, a sharp contrast to the quiet that had hung in the air just moments before. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The tomb guard stood motionless, his eyes locked on the spot where the knife had fallen. He was aware of the crowd around him, still oblivious to the near miss that had just taken place. They were going about their business, unaware that a life-threatening moment had just passed by. The guard's senses, however, were heightened, his mind still racing, processing the events that had unfolded so quickly. The attacker, who had thrown the knife with such force and intent, stood frozen in place. His eyes were wide with shock and disbelief. He had expected the blade to strike, to bring the tomb guard down, but instead he was faced with an empty space where his target had stood. The realization hit him like a cold wave. His plan had failed. The blade had missed. And now he was standing exposed, vulnerable. For a fleeting moment, the attacker's mind raced. Should he run? Should he make another move? His pulse raced in his chest, his breathing shallow. The world seemed to close in on him. He had been so sure of his actions, so certain that his strike would be successful. But now, standing there in the fading light, he realized how quickly things could go wrong. His fingers twitched, a nervous response to the tension building in his chest. The tomb guard, however, was unshaken. His posture remained perfect, his gaze fixed ahead. It was as though nothing had happened at all, but inside, his mind was working swiftly, calculating every possibility. The knife had missed, but the threat was still present. The attacker had shown his hand, and now it was time to act. The tomb guard's gaze flickered momentarily to his sidearm. He didn't reach for it. There was no need yet. He knew that the first step in situations like this was to assess, not to rush into action. He had been trained to remain calm, even in the most dangerous of situations. His role was not to provoke, not to escalate unnecessarily. His job was to protect, to defend, but always with the measured restraint that his training demanded. But the attacker's hesitation didn't last long. As the seconds stretched on, the attacker's anger grew. He had failed once, but he wasn't about to let it end like this. His eyes darted around the space, looking for an escape or perhaps another weapon. His grip tightened on his jacket, his body tense with frustration. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to walk away empty-handed. The tomb guard was aware of the shift in the man's posture, the subtle tension that had built up. It was as if the attacker was preparing for something, trying to decide on his next move. The tomb guard didn't wait for him to act. He didn't need to. The response had already been initiated, and the security personnel, now alerted to the situation, were making their way toward the scene. But before the attacker could make another move, he was confronted with the reality of his situation. The tomb guard remained unmoving, his eyes focused on the man with a quiet intensity. There was nowhere to go. There was no way out. The attacker was trapped, and he knew it. The guard's calmness in the face of danger was unsettling to the attacker. In contrast to the wild emotions coursing through him, the tomb guard stood as still as the monument he protected, his unwavering presence a stark reminder that no matter what happened, this was not a fight the attacker could win. The quiet strength of the tomb guard, his unyielding composure, was more powerful than any knife thrown in anger. For a moment, everything hung in balance. The knife, which had been so close to achieving its deadly goal, now lay discarded on the ground, its purpose unfulfilled. The tomb guard stood as a symbol of resilience, unwavering in the face of threat, his focus never straying from his duty. And as the sound of footsteps approached, the tomb guard knew that this was not the end. The attacker had made his move, but the tomb guard was ready for whatever came next. The world seemed to return to normal after the knife clattered to the ground. The crowd around the monument remained unaware of the events that had just unfolded. Some were still taking photos, while others casually admired the historical landmark. For them, it was just another day of sightseeing, their experience no different from what they had anticipated. Yet for the tomb guard and the attacker, everything had changed in a matter of seconds. The tomb guard stood still, his posture unbroken, his expression calm, despite the danger that had just passed him by. He never looked down at the knife on the ground, his focus always ahead. His years of training had prepared him for moments like this, when danger would come unexpectedly, and his duty would be tested in ways he could never predict. But in this moment, his duty remained unchanged. He was still standing guard, still protecting the tomb, still embodying the commitment that came with his role. The attacker, on the other hand, was no longer composed. His eyes were wide with disbelief, his breath shallow. The shock of the knife missing had left him rattled, and he found himself frozen, unsure of what to do next. He had not planned for this. The simple, violent action he had hoped would bring an end to the tomb guard's watch had failed. Now, instead of the chaos he anticipated, he was confronted with a calm that unsettled him deeply. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to find a way out of the situation he had created. His mind raced, calculating his next move. Could he escape unnoticed? Could he try again? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making him feel exposed. His hands trembled slightly, and the mask he had worn to conceal his identity now seemed useless. He had failed, and the realization was sinking in quickly. Before he could act, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through his thoughts. The tomb guard, still unmoving, had not missed the subtle shift in the man's behavior. He knew that this was far from over, and though the knife had missed, there was still the question of the attacker's intent. The tomb guard could sense the tension in the air. The attacker was still a threat, and until he was taken into custody, the guard's duty wasn't complete. As the security personnel arrived, they quickly assessed the situation. They had seen the knife on the ground, heard the commotion, and knew something had gone wrong. The man was surrounded, but his mind was still in turmoil. He looked around frantically, his options dwindling with each passing second. He knew he couldn't fight his way out. There were too many people, too much attention. He couldn't escape without being caught. His only choice now was to surrender, but his pride, his anger, made it hard to accept. One of the security guards stepped forward, his hand held out to the attacker, signaling him to remain still. "Don't make this worse for yourself," the guard said, his voice firm but calm. "You've already failed. There's no reason to make things more difficult." The man's jaw clenched as he glared at the tomb guard, who still stood silently, watching him with unflinching eyes. For a moment, it seemed as though the attacker might try something desperate. He tensed, his muscles ready to spring into action. But before he could make a move, the tomb guard took a single step forward. It wasn't an aggressive gesture, but the mere movement sent a clear message. This was not a fight the attacker could win. No matter what he did, the guard would not back down. The presence of the tomb guard was a steady, unshakable force, and the attacker knew, deep down, that there was no escaping it. Seeing the movement, the security personnel quickly moved in to restrain the man. They moved with practiced efficiency, their training kicking in as they quickly subdued him, ensuring he couldn't cause any more trouble. The attacker struggled for a moment, but his resistance was weak, fading fast as he realized the futility of his actions. As the security guards took control of the situation, the tomb guard remained still, his expression unchanged. His eyes followed the attacker as he was led away, and for the briefest moment there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Was it relief? Or perhaps just a quiet acknowledgement that his duty had been fulfilled, that the danger had passed? The crowd, still largely unaware of the full scope of the event, began to take notice. Some were drawn to the commotion, their curiosity piqued. Others, however, simply carried on, more interested in their phones or their sightseeing. But the few who had seen the attacker's actions, those who had witnessed the tense moment, could sense the gravity of what had just occurred. One of the tourists, a young woman, had caught the whole thing. She had been standing nearby, taking a picture of the monument when the knife had been thrown. Her breath had caught in her throat as she saw the blade sail through the air, her heart racing in those few seconds of uncertainty. But when the knife missed, and the tomb guard remained unharmed, she felt a wave of awe wash over her. She had seen something incredible, something that would stay with her forever. Her hands shook as she lowered her camera, realizing just how close she had come to witnessing something tragic. The tomb guard, however, was calm, his presence unwavering, as though nothing had happened at all. It was as if he were a part of the monument itself, a silent protector whose duty was above the noise and chaos of the world around him. As the security team escorted the attacker away, the tomb guard's thoughts turned inward for a moment. He had faced danger, but it had been the kind of danger he had always expected. What had changed today wasn't the threat, it was the way he had handled it. The guard knew that in moments like this, it wasn't the knife or the attacker that mattered. It was his ability to remain steadfast, to protect what needed protecting, no matter the cost. The commotion eventually died down, and the monument returned to its peaceful, solemn state. The tourists, though shaken, continued to explore the grounds, but the mood had changed. Some walked a little slower, their thoughts heavy with the realization of what had nearly happened. Others, like the young woman, would walk away with a new sense of respect for the tomb guard and the duty he represented. But for the tomb guard himself, there was no time for reflection. His job was not over. The sun had set, and night would soon fall over the monument. He had faced a threat, but now, as always, he had to return to his post and continue watching over the tomb. The job wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was a job that mattered. It was a job that required dedication, focus, and an unshakable resolve. As he resumed his position, standing tall and unwavering, he knew that this moment would pass. The danger had been averted and the world would go on. But in that brief, tense moment when the knife had been thrown, the tomb guard had done what he was trained to do. He had protected the sacred ground. And that was all that mattered. The night had settled over the monument like a heavy, quiet blanket. The sky, darkening with the last traces of daylight, seemed to mirror the calm that had returned to the area. The tomb guard stood in his place, still and composed as ever. His silhouette, sharp against the backdrop of the monument, seemed to blend into the history of the site he protected. The danger had passed, the attacker had been subdued, and the world around him had gone back to its normal pace. For the tomb guard, the events of the day, though remarkable, were just another chapter in the ongoing story of his duty. This was the reality of his life, standing watch, facing challenges, and keeping the peace. The world around him was constantly changing, but his role remained the same. He was a protector. His job was simple but important, to stand guard over the tomb, to honor the fallen, and to maintain the sanctity of the space. Though the crowd had mostly dispersed, a few visitors remained, quietly reflecting on what had just happened. Some had witnessed the tense moment, their eyes wide with disbelief, but they hadn't fully understood the gravity of what had almost occurred. For them, it was just another piece of the story of the monument, a dramatic moment they could share with their friends or family. But for the tomb guard, it was a deeply personal experience. This wasn't just a job to him, it was a mission. It was a responsibility that required focus, dedication, and a willingness to face danger without hesitation. As the final few visitors wandered away, the tomb guard's thoughts drifted inward. He didn't often allow himself moments of reflection. His job required constant attention. But now, as the night deepened, he couldn't help but think about what had just transpired. The near miss with the knife had been a reminder of the unpredictable nature of life. It had been a sudden threat, one that came without warning, but in the end, it had been a test of his ability to stay calm and focused. The attack had been thwarted, but it hadn't been easy. There had been a moment just before the knife missed, when he had felt that rush of uncertainty, that split-second awareness of how quickly things could go wrong. But in that moment, when everything seemed to slow down, he had done what he had been trained to do. He had stayed calm. He had not reacted out of fear or panic. He had simply stood his ground, waiting for the outcome, knowing that his training had prepared him for this. Now, as the sounds of the evening breeze rustled the trees around the monument, the tomb guard felt a quiet sense of pride. He had done his duty. The sacred ground remained untouched, and the legacy of those who had fallen remained secure. It was a small victory, but it was enough. He thought about the attacker for a moment. The man had come to the monument with violent intent, but he had failed. The tomb guard didn't wish harm on anyone, but he understood that his role often placed him in the position of preventing harm to others. It was a difficult job, one that required a clear mind and an unshakable sense of duty. In the end, the attacker had been arrested and would face the consequences of his actions. But for the tomb guard, it was not about punishment. It was about preserving the peace, ensuring that the tomb and the people who came to honor it were kept safe. A soft, rustling sound brought the tomb guard's attention back to the present. It was the wind moving through the trees. The noise was peaceful, almost soothing, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to feel the stillness of the night. The world around him had calmed, and the adrenaline from the earlier events had begun to fade. But even as the tension lifted, the tomb guard remained vigilant. He knew that his shift wasn't over yet. There was still work to be done. As he stood there, his thoughts turned to the visitors who had come and gone throughout the day. Some had paid their respects quietly, others had taken photos, capturing memories of their visit. But all of them, in their own way, had participated in something larger than themselves. They had come to this place to honor the past, to remember the sacrifices made by those who had come before them. And in his small part of the world, the tomb guard had ensured that their visit remained unbroken, that the peace was preserved. The tomb guard was well aware that, for most people, his presence would go unnoticed. To them, he was just a figure in the background, a silent protector who blended into the landscape. But that was exactly how it was meant to be. He wasn't there to be seen or praised. He was there to do his job, to stand tall and unwavering, to ensure that the history of the monument and the fallen soldiers it represented was respected and maintained. As the minutes passed, the moon rose higher in the sky, casting a pale light over the monument and the surrounding area. The tomb guard could feel the coolness of the night air against his skin, but he didn't move. He was used to the stillness, to the long hours of standing guard without complaint. It was a solitary existence, but it was one that brought him peace. In a world that was constantly in motion, his role was a rare constant. The quiet of the night was broken only by the occasional footsteps of security guards passing by, checking the area, ensuring everything was in order. The tomb guard gave them a nod of acknowledgement as they walked past, but he didn't speak. His job was simple: stay at his post, remain alert, and protect. It was a job that didn't require words, only actions. And yet, even in his silence, he knew that what he did mattered. It mattered to the families of the fallen soldiers. It mattered to the people who came to visit to pay their respects. And it mattered to him. This was his duty, his responsibility, and he took it seriously. In a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable, his role was a reminder that some things remained constant, unshaken by time or circumstance. As the night continued to unfold, the tomb guard remained where he stood, unmoving and resolute. The world around him might change, but his mission stayed the same: to protect, to honor, and to serve. No matter what challenges came his way, he would always stand tall, guarding the sacred ground, a symbol of strength, discipline, and unwavering commitment. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the knife, not the attacker, but the quiet dignity of the tomb guard and his unyielding devotion to his duty. It was a legacy that would live on, far beyond the events of that evening. The monument would continue to stand, the memories of those who had fallen would remain, and the tomb guard would continue to protect it day after day, year after year. And that, for the tomb guard, was enough.